Kathleen Brown is the David Boyce Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also a faculty affiliate of Africana Studies, the History and Sociology of Science, and the Center for Research on Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies, and the lead faculty historian on the Pen and Slavery Project. Tremendous mission you have there at Pennsylvania. In 2021-22, she was the Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at Cambridge University, United Kingdom. Her scholarship has been supported by fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, and the Bunting Institute of Radcliffe College. Brown's research interests center on intersectional questions of race, gender, sexuality, and labor in colonial North American, Atlantic, and early US contexts. She is the author of 2 prize-winning books, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, Gender, Race, and Power in Colonial Virginia, which was published in '96, and Foul Bodies, Cleanliness in Early America in 2009. She has recently published her newest book, which is here, called Undoing Slavery, Bodies, Race, and Rights in the Age of Abolition, that considers how the campaign to end slavery entangled activists in a complex process of undoing long-standing practices and habits of the body central to that institution. Undoing Slavery incorporates research in legal and medical history to provide a historical understanding of the human body at the center of debates about Black citizenship and the regulations of Black people's movements, labor, and reproductive capacity. So there's no better person to launch our 50th anniversary edition of the Center for Global Humanities than Kathleen Brown. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and congratulations on your 15th year. I'm going to begin my talk tonight, and I should say I'm going to speak rather formally so I stick to my script and don't run over time, just for the first part of this talk, and then when I cover the material that the students were going to focus on until their mean professor made them read the whole book, I'll zoom in a little bit more and I'll go more spontaneously. So just bear with me with the sort of formal part of the presentation. Just move that out of the way. Okay, I'm going to begin my talk with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's The Slave Mother, part of a collection of her original poems published in 1854. Harper, the niece of abolitionist William Watkins of Baltimore and a celebrated speaker and author in her own right, was well connected in abolitionist circles. The poem was likely inspired by her encounters with female refugees from slavery as they debriefed with the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, but perhaps it also reflected her orphan's grief at the loss of her own mother. Heard you that shriek? It rose so wildly on the air, it seems as if a burdened heart was breaking in despair. Saw you those hands so sadly clasped, the bowed and feeble head, the shuddering of that fragile form, the look of grief and dread. Saw you the sad, imploring eye, its every glance was pain, as if a storm of agony were sweeping through the brain. She is a mother pale with fear, her boy clings to her side, and in her kirtle vainly tries his trembling form to hide. He is not hers, although she bore for him a mother's pains. He is not hers, although her blood is coursing through his veins. He is not hers, for cruel hands may rudely tear apart the only wreath of household love that binds her breaking heart. His lightest word has been a tone of music round her heart, their lives a streamlet blent in one. O Father, must they part? No marvel then these bitter shrieks disturb the listening air. She is a mother and her heart is breaking in despair. Harper compelled her readers to bear virtual witness with their eyes and ears to the condition of the enslaved mother's entire body, her shrieks, her clasped hands, her bowed head, her shuddering fragile form, her eye and her brain. In this, as in many abolitionist poems and hymns about enslaved mothers, the mother's grief has dramatic physical manifestations. Her tears, her broken heart, the sundering of her blood connection to her child, all testify to violation. Despite the mother's birth pains, that coursing blood, and their blended lives, the narrator's voice declares 3 times, "He is not hers." In my talk tonight, drawn from my book Undoing Slavery, I argue that abolition has something important to teach us about the history of the body, and the body's history has something important to teach us about abolition. In the larger work, I argue that the abolition movement intervened crucially in the condition of millions of enslaved bodies, as well as in the debates about the nature of race. It was an uphill battle. Over the course of 2 centuries, the common scientific and popular understanding of race shifted from one in which bodies were understood to be imprinted by climate and experience to one in which race was believed to be innate. This shift was an outgrowth not only of scientific and medical racism, but of the law, the federal and state protections of slave property that perpetuated slavery intergenerationally and obstructed people from claiming freedom for themselves and their children, even if they escaped to so-called free states. In addition to crucial interventions in the body's relationship to race and rights, one of abolition's most important overlooked legacies was its insistence that intimate domestic relations were human rights just as much as the rights of unimpeded and uncoerced travel and the privileges of citizenship. The abolitionist focus on the body brought family integrity, especially the mother-child relationship, care of the body, and the rights to move at will into the frame of human rights. If there was one claim with which nearly all abolitionists agreed, it was, "We are of one blood." From the 17th through 19th centuries, activists inspired by religious beliefs and the persistent struggles of African-descended people for liberation used this refrain to claim a universal human condition. One blood joined a panoply of rights claims made in embodied terms that included natural rights, birthright, and these are quotes from the texts of this period, starting in the 17th century, the rights of Englishmen, and breathing the free or pure air of England. Many of these concepts reflected Roman definitions of citizenship based on jus sanguinis, the law of blood or ancestry, or jus soli, the law of soil or birthplace, and pointed to the entangled meanings of political subject and human within early modern European national spaces. Abolitionists hearkened to the blood, a vital fluid endowed with spiritual meaning and commonly invoked to express familial and ethno-national belonging as the basis for a shared humanity. The claims to one blood had strong roots in Quaker theology and resonated with humanistic themes across much of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The text, "God hath made one blood all nations of men," came from Acts 17:26, a New Testament passage addressing the interactions among Jews and Gentiles to claim a common humanity rooted in divine creation. Much abolitionist fervor was sparked by seeing blood flow as a consequence of enslavers' efforts to crush the wills of people whose labor they were extracting. The act of witnessing or experiencing violent bloodshed figured prominently in early activists' accounts, making blood more than metaphor for abolitionists. Religiously inspired and justified, abolitionists reiterated this specific claim to universalism, even as 19th century medical and legal contexts transformed the political significance of blood to emphasize distinction and inclusion. There was, however, nothing inherently egalitarian or universal about blood. Historically, blood was fundamental to distinctions among families and populations and a means of naturalizing hierarchy. Spanish Catholics had invaded lands in the Americas with a genealogical framework that distinguished Christians from heathens and indigenous peoples from Africans on the basis of blood. In Spanish parlance, African blackness might sometimes be expressed in legal and theological terms as, quote, black blood. Blood also became an important foundation of the reproducible chattel principle in 1662 with the Virginia codification of what was already common Atlantic and indeed world historical practice, the inheritance of slave status through the mother's connection to the child. Several decades after the 1662 law, this legal principle became known among Anglo lawmakers by its shorthand, partus sequitur ventrum, a retrospective attribution to the Roman legal principle in which children of parents with different statuses inherited the condition of the mother in whose belly they grew. By the 18th century, references to race were regularly replacing an older focus on nations around the Atlantic basin. The one-blood claims of early abolitionists challenged the idea that blood was the basis for distinction of family, nation, and race. They also contradicted slavery's maternal inheritance principle and scientific efforts to locate race in the body. In addition, one blood provided abolitionists with a biblical path to natural rights arguments centered on birthright. Abolitionists imagined liberty as the embodied realization of rights endowed by natural law. They based many of their claims on the premise that a person came by these rights at birth and could not be alienated from them any more than personhood could be asserted or sustained in the absence of a body. With birth, in other words, came physical existence in the world, and so began the individual's endowment with natural rights. Birthright, a concept rooted in medieval political theory about the subject's relation to the monarch, was the key to inalienable political rights. We might note that without motherhood, there could be no birthright, a requirement that natural rights theorists overlooked. But what could birthright mean within a society that relied on a law of maternal inheritance to reproduce slavery? Birthright became a key concept in the effort to undo slavery's reproduction of itself through the colonization of the bodies of enslaved women. It motivated the sentimental focus on enslaved mothers, and it also played a role in the process through which self-emancipating refugees figured their successful escapes as a rebirth of new liberated selves. One of the curious features of the campaign to abolish slavery was how much easier it was for activists to convince their fellow English and American countrymen to identify and legally prohibit the transatlantic traffic in slaves than it was to end slavery itself. We can see it here in Thomas Jefferson's reasoning in his State of the Union address in 1806, as he anticipated the end of the slave trade in 1808. Here, he explicitly condemned the transatlantic traffic in slaves as a violation of human rights. So you can see here, to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. And he actually uses that term, human rights. Jefferson, however, made no acknowledgement of the suffering of African-descended laborers threatened by the whip or the separation of mother and child. Instead, he preferred to identify the rights violation in the trafficking of Africans across the ocean. But of course, the prohibition of the Atlantic traffic did not end the slave traffic itself. Slave traders continued to transport captives across the Atlantic, although in smaller numbers. But more important, in the United States, the domestic or internal slave trade grew to take the place of the oceanic traffic. Jefferson's concept of human rights failed to make any acknowledgement of the condition of enslaved people already trafficked. Notably missing is any acknowledgement by Jefferson of the enslaved mother's physical and emotional labors in bearing and raising children, a crucial set of unpaid labors that produced planter wealth and would only grow in significance after the 1808 prohibition on the overseas slave trade made enslavers in the U.S. wholly dependent on births as a source of new enslaved labor. Jefferson should have been thinking of this, as we now know, because of his own relationship with the enslaved Sally Hemings and his fathering of at least 6 of her children. The domestic or internal slave trade that grew after the 1808 suppression of the Atlantic traffic was built on the reproductive labors of enslaved women like Hemmings and created an entirely new geography of coerced movement of trafficked people. During this period, following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the end to the slave trade in 1808, enslavers in the Upper South began moving people west and south in coffles, creating a spectacle of suffering and coercion that inflicted terrible pain on those being forced to leave families and homes, and shocked all who witnessed them. The movement of Virginia-born slaves from the Upper South to the Lower South eventually substituted for the supply of African-born slaves brought into the United States through the transatlantic slave trade. The proportion of Virginia-born slaves bound for New Orleans accelerated as Virginia planters turned from tobacco to wheat, from 1 in 12 enslaved people in Virginia during the 1790s to 1 in 5 after 1810. Resistance to abolitionist one-blood arguments and defenses of slavery through elaborate anti-Black theories took many forms. The notion that race resided in specific structures of the skin, originally asserted in the 17th century, found new traction in the 18th century, accompanied by dubious evidence that skin color could be traced to blood pigments. These scientific claims about raced blood persisted into the early 19th century, but were supplanted by a new focus on specific body parts interpreted as raced: the cranium, the fibula, the female pelvis, the hair, and the nose. Doctors as various in their theoretical positions as Benjamin Rush, William Horner, Charles Caldwell, Samuel Morton, Josiah Nott, Samuel Cartwright, and E.M. Pendleton all contributed to a view of biological race that distinguished Black and white bodies and their susceptibility to disease. Morton, for example, collected skulls from around the world and purported to rank intelligence by race through measurements of cranial capacity. Along with theorists like Nott, scientists like Morton defined the human family as inherently white and either diminished African-descended peoples from full belonging or imagined them as a separate creation. With each new racialization of the body, abolitionist insistence upon one blood lost some of its power as a claim for universal humanity. The racist medical claims about distinct racial anatomies and creations, understood as inherited through the blood of ancestry, moreover, underscored blood's narrowest and most hierarchical meanings. Massachusetts-born Hosea Easton intervened in the burgeoning medical literature on race with arguments framed in the theories about the influence of climate and diet on blood and health. Easton was an African-American congressional minister and the veteran of several protests against segregated church seating. In his treatise on the intellectual character and civil and political condition of the colored people of the United States, published in 1837, Easton analyzed the plight of enslaved Africans and their descendants as one of stolen birthright, lineal rupture, and physiological as well as cultural adaptation. After being, quote, lineally stolen from their native country and detained for centuries in a strange land as hewers of wood and drawers of water, he lamented, their blood, habits, minds, and bodies have undergone such a change as to cause them to lose all legal or natural relations to their mother country. Having lost this connection to Africa, he argued, quote, they identified as belonging to no country, denied birthright in one, and had it stolen from them in another. They had lost title to both worlds. Easton's larger purpose was to analyze the damage slavery inflicted on the intellectual and physical development of the enslaved, but he also denounced the racism that eroded beliefs in the unity of humankind. In a graphic and powerful section of his pamphlet, he recounted white people's quotidian denigrations of Black people's lips, noses, hair, feet, and skin. Many of the characteristics that white people ascribed to race, he argued, were in fact the consequence of slavery's brutalizing physiological impact on pregnant women and their offspring, an application of the widely accepted theory of maternal impressions to enslaved women. In other places in his text, Easton argued that differences in skin color and hair texture were normal variations found in nature and reason for celebration rather than evidence of distinct racial categories. Once on North American soil, he argued, Africans became seasoned to become Americans, quote, by birth and blood. As Easton explained it, quote, complexion has never been made the legal test of citizenship in any age of the world. It has been established generally by birth and blood. If blood has anything to do with it, then we are able to prove that there is not a drop of African blood, according to the general acceptation of the term, flowing in the veins of an American-born child, though black as jet. The blood of the parents in seasoning to this climate becomes changed. Also, the food of the mother being the product of this country and congenial to the climate, the atmosphere she breathes, the surrounding objects which strike her senses, all are principles which establish and give character to the constitutional principles of the child, among which the blood is an essential constituent. So what he's saying is that by being in the United States, and especially for African-descended children born in the United States, what makes a person is the climate and the environment and the diet and the air, and that actually changes the child's blood to conform to that new space. Easton conceded that slavery might leave its mark on the physiognomy, posture, and demeanor, but he insisted the imprint of manners, diets, climate, and government meant that, quote, every child born in America, even if it be as black as jet, is American by birth and blood. Under the dissector's knife, he claimed, all bodies were the same. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears a little, and I'm going to be talking mainly for the rest of this talk about Chapter 5, which is a kind of surprising chapter in some ways because it's less focused on enslaved people's bodies and more focused on the bodies of white consumers, although as it turns out, also black consumers. So first, we need to consider that the coffles moving enslaved people from the upper South to the lower South were not the only movements of African-descended people during this period. In fact, enslaved people chose to escape slavery, crossing state lines, and in so doing, raising several perplexing questions about race and jurisdiction. What happened to an enslaved person's status if they crossed state lines into a jurisdiction that didn't support slavery, where slavery was illegal? What was the status of a child born in a so-called free state to a formerly enslaved woman? In other words, if she crossed the state line pregnant and ended up in a place like Pennsylvania, was the child free or enslaved? For decades, state courts and state liberty laws battled over the answers to these questions, and the questions kind of pit legal jurisdiction against a more racialized notion of inherited slave status. And these battles, though, ultimately gave way in 1850 to the Supreme Court's insistence on federal jurisdiction with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in that year. So while some abolitionists after 1850 turned their attention to providing assistance to those who escaped, others imagined a global strategy involving the crops produced by slave labor. And here I've just given you a kind of handy little chart. The most important thing about these images is to show you the gradations of refinement that match to gradations of color, because this ends up being a very important part of the politics of this. Each of these up here on the screen, sugar, rice, tobacco, cotton, and indigo, became global commodities. They were produced on plantations through the labor of enslaved people. Each of these has an absolutely fascinating global history of production, transport, and consumption. Several of these, rice, sugar, and cotton, became part of the optics of whiteness as refinement. In other words, the most expensive varieties of these would be the whitest, and they would be considered, and they were, in terms of the processing of the product, of the most refined. Quakers were among the first to advocate avoidance of slave-produced goods early in the 18th century. Quaker Benjamin Lay, John Woolman, and Anthony Benezet all engaged in their own personal boycotts of slave-produced goods and tried to encourage their fellow Quakers. And indeed, there was an American precedent for boycotts during the American Revolution. Americans came away from that believing that they had been more powerful than they actually had been with the boycotts. But when Quakers in England were trying to create political pressure to end the slave trade in England, they turned to boycotts during the 1790s, not that long after boycotts had been used by colonial Americans in the 1760s and 1770s. The boycotts in England were amazingly successful. A huge boycott of sugar produced in the British West Indies, and they galvanized the anti-slavery movement in England. They put female consumers at the center, that a woman who was endeavoring to run a household on principles of virtue and morality could not afford to bring a morally tainted product like slave-produced sugar into her household. And the taint of the sugar's production was equated to a moral taint, but during the sugar boycotts, people spoke of the sugar as being stained with blood, okay, being repellent because of that blood. And what these boycotts also did was they reanimated the connection between the exploited producer, in this case, an enslaved laborer, and the consumer. And that connection tended to disappear when plantation crops became commodities that went on their journey across oceans to these global markets, where the kind of knowledge of the conditions of their production were often not apparent. So one of those who embarked on the boycott strategy in the United States was a man named George Washington Taylor. And like many of his fellow moral boycotters, he was a Quaker. He was from New Garden, Pennsylvania, which was a very hot Underground Railroad site, and it was filled with active Quaker and Black abolitionists. And it had the advantage, if you will, in being just across the border from Maryland, and so enslaved people who were making their way up from Delaware and Maryland and as far as Virginia by land, that would be one of the first places they would cross into is Chester County, and New Garden is right there. Almost immediately, George Washington Taylor ran into problems sourcing cotton. He was trying to find cotton that was not produced by slave labor. And then, when he could find that cotton, trying to manufacture it in a way that would please consumers. And so almost immediately, he ran into problems, complaints from consumers about the size of the bolts, especially for use of cotton sheeting, the quality of the weave. People complained it was scratchy. The fastness of the colors. You know, why couldn't he get free labor cotton dyed in beautiful colors that would actually last through many washings? And he discovered this in his effort to establish a store in Philadelphia in 1846. There had been free labor produce stores in Philadelphia for decades before his. But this was a kind of a new phase in this effort to break the slave power by boycotting slave-produced goods. And even though we could look at his business perhaps as not a complete success, he had customers and networks in Ohio, New York, Vermont, and actually in England also. His Philadelphia Friends Free Produce Society, and that was the cumbersome name of it, ultimately, through funding by an Englishman named Joseph Sturge, hired two pretty earnest but hapless and luckless agents. And these two poor fellows, Levi Coffin and Nathan Thomas, I kid you not, walked around the American South looking for cotton that had been produced through free labor. Levi Coffin actually wrote back to George Washington Taylor at one point and said, "You cannot believe how much weight I've lost walking all over Tennessee, like my clothes are hanging on my body." And they didn't actually have a very clear definition of what counted as free labor. So that was one of the questions they immediately encountered. They hoped to find, and did find, some small producers, mainly Quakers, who didn't actually have access to slave labor and were using family labor or other hired labor. But the problem came up in the ginning process, because small planters didn't have gins usually. They would turn to their large planter neighbors who ran the gins on slave labor, and for a price they would get their own smaller crop ginned. Okay, so that was clearly a problem. If you were going to source cotton and market it as free labor cotton, you couldn't have slaves ginning it. They had other difficulties. They really didn't know anything about cotton. When they got down there, they didn't really know when it was harvested. They didn't even know that sometimes there would be two pickings and that the second picking was considerably inferior to the first picking. When they found somebody who'd help them make purchases and arrange for shipping, he tried to coach them both in the grades of cotton and in the financial apparatus they would need, and they just kind of didn't catch on very quickly, so there were all kinds of problems with that. The cotton gins created a kind of interesting problem for them, as I've already said, and Nathan Thomas, one of the agents, actually raised the issue of whether the Philadelphia Friends Free Produce Society could buy cotton gins for small planters and therefore ensure that the produce was free produce. So he raises this issue in January of 1846. So this is actually before the Fugitive Slave Law. They've actually gotten into this as some of the politics around slave escapes are heating up. Levi Coffin had been running a store of his own in both Ohio and in Indiana, and he arranged to have two gins constructed, and then he distributed those gins to a couple of small planters. They happened to be Quakers who they thought might be able to give them a reliable source of free cotton. George Washington Taylor contacted a cotton gin manufacturer in New England about purchasing gins to distribute to poor white planters. As we look at it, it could have been this very interesting moment. We might think of it as almost like a modern-day development project, right? You supply small producers with the mechanism, the technology they need in order to be able to bring their produce to a different market. But there were just no funds. There were no funds to make that kind of effort to supply gins on the scale they would need to supply to those small producers. Meanwhile, several British abolitionists were suggesting that maybe the way to go was to avoid the U.S. South altogether and try to source cotton from South Asia. George Washington Taylor himself began to take trips in 1850 to look at the conditions of production for a number of different slave-produced commodities. Like many previous activists who had witnessed and then been transformed politically, he traveled to Puerto Rico, Barbados, Jamaica, Demerara, St. Croix, and Bermuda. And ultimately, only St. Croix kind of met his standard for the labor conditions that he thought were close enough to free production to be able to source the sugar from there and sell it in his store. The suggestion that ultimately slave labor, the labor of African-descended slaves in the U.S. South, would need to be replaced by a cheap labor source, brought some of the Americans under the influence in part of the British, who had already begun to explore this option of sourcing labor cheaply through contract from places in South Asia. Many English and American abolitionists opposed the idea of replacing slave labor with contract, or as it was called, coolie labor. Others were surprisingly less disturbed, in part out of their sense that Eastern labor, and they lumped South Asian in with Eastern labor, was already degraded. That is to say, it already came from a place where there was no sense of birthright in the natural rights sense. And so none other than the husband of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Calvin Stowe, and American statesman Henry Clay both argued that this kind of indentured labor was a real winner as a replacement for slavery because it would be so cheap. And what Joseph Sturge and several other American abolitionists argued, and Sturge was the Englishman who had actually shelled out his own money to support George Washington Taylor's effort to source free cotton, they argued, in fact, that if you degraded labor by going for the cheapest labor, then you would actually diminish the condition of all labor, and that was actually the opposite of what abolitionists were hoping to do. Okay, so I want to go back to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper for a minute, just to kind of note that many white supporters of free produce lost their enthusiasm for this as a strategy. But some of the staunchest adherents of the boycott movement were Black abolitionists, and one of them was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And what she does here, I'm going to actually read this to you because it's really very interesting. She used a lot of the rhetoric that had characterized the boycotts from the 1790s in England, the boycott of West Indian sugar. So we have, the possible stain of blood on the white optic of cotton, of pure cotton. I have reason to be thankful that I'm able to give a little more for a free labor dress. If it is a little coarser, I can thank God that upon its warp and woof I see no stain of blood and tears, that to procure a little finer muslin for my limbs, no crushed and broken heart went out in sighs. But what she actually did next was really interesting and pointed to the conflicting meanings of blood, the abolitionists who had argued for one blood, a kind of universal claim. But Frances Watkins Harper herself was African descended, and she felt that she actually had a blood connection to enslaved people, in that other meaning of blood as family, kin, ancestry. So she argued, if the liberation of the slave demanded it, I could consent to part with a portion of the blood from my own veins, if that would do him any good. Much as the Hindu character in a story she had heard was loath to cut a tree because, being a believer in the transmigration of souls, he thought the soul of his father had passed into it. In other words, she felt a kinship with enslaved people of African descent. And so for her, boycotting and imagining that the blood in the sugar or in the cotton would touch her own body touched her more deeply than a white consumer, that she actually was caught up in that conflicting meaning of what blood, how people understood blood. Frederick Douglass, who's probably one of the most famous Black abolitionists, also stuck with the boycotts, also encouraged others, used a lot of the same language, and in fact, he seems to have borrowed almost verbatim from Frances Harper about blood and grief lingering in the fabrics of women's garments. And the point, of course, was to make it repulsive to a white female consumer to think about wearing fine garments that had been produced from cotton that was grown through slave labor, and to think of that product also as polluting. Okay, so what did these boycotts do? They recruited and radicalized abolitionists, people who got involved in the boycotts. It kind of solidified, in some cases, their sense of mission, their cause, their belonging to a community. And often they went on to other abolitionist activism. And this is true even for the ones who kind of lose their enthusiasm for the boycotts and go back to buying slave-produced goods. They often went on to do other abolitionist politics. They placed the consumer and her household at the center of the activism. And they prompted a new abolitionist politics of the body that connected the consumer's body to the body of the laborer. That connection, which was kind of mystically erased by the commodification process, where in fact you don't really know that much about how a good is made. All you know is your desire for the good and the prestige of it and the aesthetic beauty of it. The boycotts also prompted new geopolitical knowledge seeking. Men like George Washington Taylor traveled to look around at the world in the Caribbean, a post-slavery world technically, but sometimes what he discovered was the conditions of labor didn't seem that different from slavery. And it also prompted new technological and agricultural knowledge seeking, trying to understand whether, in fact, supplying cotton gins would be the thing that would make the labor of producing cotton free or not. And then, of course, raising these questions. What exactly is free labor? Okay, and I'm going to conclude by just kind of raising a question. Perhaps we can take it up in the question and answer. What can we learn from the history of abolitionist activism? So I think first, that the abolitionists, they're sometimes accused of not really understanding that wage labor was also exploitative, that they turned from slave labor almost naively, imagining wage labor to be free labor, in a sense that later critics of wage labor argued that no, it was actually wage slavery. They interpreted slavery as a barbaric form of violation of embodied self-sovereignty, and they understood that self-sovereignty as part of a natural rights inheritance, a birthright. And for some, wage labor seemed to preserve the laborer's embodied self-sovereignty, subjected it to discipline, but allowed the integrity of that embodied self-sovereignty. That was how they saw it. And again, critics of wage labor, of course, understood it very differently. They also demonstrated the insufficiency of rights alone, that what needed protection wasn't rights per se, but rather the body of the person claiming the rights. That embodied self-sovereignty was a form of self-protection and self-determination. It included the ability to choose belonging and connection to others, and to protect those connections. And it also included autonomy over decisions to move or remain in place. But finally, I think for me, one of the big takeaways, and this is something I emphasize with my students, that significant political work was done by people who might not pass our tests for moral purity and anti-racism. They were flawed human beings. Some of them did vital political work and held on to anti-Black attitudes, okay, but nonetheless engaged in the work. And this part of it, going back to the past and finding that people who did seemingly heroic acts as part of very important social movements, finding out that they were actually flawed in serious ways, is part of grappling with history as grown-ups and not looking for history as a fairy tale to make us feel good about ourselves. And I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you.